I believe we have Robert Brodsky on the phone. Hello, Robert.
I'm here. Good to see you.
Hey.
Good to talk to you.
How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Yeah, been busy?
We're trying.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, I see the story that, and I saw this is actually in the paper today, isn't it?
It's in today's paper, yes.
Yes. The study, more drivers in fatal crashes had drugs versus alcohol in the system. Okay, well, why don't you...
Well, AAA Northeast released some figures that they analyzed from the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. They have a database called the Fatality Analysis Reporting System. And there was some interesting findings for both New York State and for Long Island, which found that, surprisingly, in 2016, which is the most recent year for which data is available, more drivers in New York State and on Long Island who were involved in fatal automobile crashes tested positive after their death when they analyzed their blood for drugs than they did for alcohol. Well, so that's not to say that drugs are a contributing factor versus alcohol, but that the blood tests after the fact indicate that they were in their system, and raising questions about whether or not we need to step up drugged driving awareness.
Yeah, well, when I first read the article, I didn't know how far it was broken down. I was going to take you to task for using the idea that they had drugs in the system.
Correct.
Marijuana traditionally has been demonized by... they had marijuana in their system. They also had meth, and they had cocaine, and they had 5 other things. But the only thing they spoke about was the marijuana in their system, because that was the buzzword, and that's what got everybody excited.
That's the marijuana findings are very interesting, and they are very somewhat controversial. What they found, if you break down the types of drugs that are found in Long Island drivers who had fatal motor vehicle crashes, and in New York State as well, that more drivers reported or were tested positive for THC and elements of other cannabinoids than other narcotics, despite the fact that we in Long Island are going through an opioid crisis. So there were 17 deaths, 10 in Suffolk, 7 in Nassau, in which the driver had THC in their bloodstream. Now, this can be extremely misleading,
right?
As law enforcement officials pointed out, and marijuana advocates point out.
Right.
Marijuana remains in your blood for, depending if you are a regular user and other factors, but it could be 2 weeks, could be 4 weeks, but it certainly is not indicative whether or not the marijuana had been smoked.
Right.
And is a causation of why the crash occurred. On the other hand, there are other individuals who had fentanyl, oxycodone, and other different kinds of harder narcotics in their system. Those have a different half-life. They're usually out of your system between 12 hours. There's a greater reason to believe that it has a cause and effect.
Yeah. Well, in my history, I actually used to be a drug counselor for the Communications Workers of America for AT&T Long Lines in New York City. And that was one of the issues that people used to bring to me, is that they knew people on a job who would use cocaine, but traces of the cocaine would be gone within 2 days. And the pot smoker was getting busted because that would stay in his system for a month.
That is true.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot harder, especially after the fact, when you are dealing with motorists who were, who died in automobile crashes. We're not in the we don't have the ability to interview these folks and ask them, anything about when they used the narcotic. It's impossible to determine.
Right.
So there is a lot of unanswered questions, and in some of the cases in which the drivers had THC in their system, there was also, in I think 8 different cases, there was either alcohol or other harder narcotics in their system as well. So it's impossible to determine what percentage of, how do you determine causation, whether it's 50% for alcohol or whatnot.
Well, that's the thing, is we can look at all the statistics, but does it really tell us anything when they're not really gone through and separated and explained as far as the types of drugs that you're talking about and what they do? And that's why when I don't know who it was, I had a couple of conversations with people who were talking about developers on Long Island and putting up buildings, and they talk about affordable housing, and I told them that I would no longer accept that as a word. I want to know what affordable is. And this kind of applies to this article too. Chris has had drugs. Well, it's too broad, and people are going to jump to their own conclusion as to what this means just from the headline.
Right.
Especially since at a time when marijuana legalization is on the forefront.
Right, and I believe that, AAA is using this as a platform to raise a discussion about drug driving, which certainly does get less attention than DWI. Drug driving is kind of it certainly doesn't get the same kind of national focus as DWI, and because August is, according to their data, the month where their most number of incidents of drug driving fatal crashes occur, they're using it as a jumping point to have a conversation. Though I spoke to folks over at MAD who would not necessarily endorse this and think that it's a dangerous territory to kind of cut between should we be focused on drugs versus alcohol, and make sure not to take our eyes off the ball to focus on another thing.
Well, I mean, I remember when they went through, I think it was a congressional hearing, and they went through all of the types of drugs and were, relating how many people had died from each one of those. And, they did alcohol, which does about, I think they said 60,000 a year on the roads are killed from direct result of drunk driving. And then they went through opioids and heroin, and they got down to marijuana, and the head of the DEA kind of didn't want to answer the question until they pushed him and said, how many people died from this? And he looked up and he said none. And they asked him, well, then what are we doing here? And I would really, when I read things like this, I would just like to see them taken out separately, if that's at all possible. Because usually if you have someone using one drug, they don't have much of a problem using another one with it. But to use the same brush and paint.
Well, unfortunately, the federal government has still determined that marijuana goes in the same Class A classification of narcotics in the same category as cocaine and heroin.
Schedule 1, right?
Schedule 1. So there's not much law enforcement can do to separate the two. What's interesting, though, is that if you break down the numbers further, this data that AAA released focuses only on the driver. If you expand it to focus on the passengers as well, then alcohol once again becomes the primary cause. So you would find more.
What does that imply? Larger the sample?
Probably a larger sample. It's probably also might involve some kind of behavior among folks who are on driving on some kind of harder narcotic. Maybe they are driving solo for whatever reason, while those who are maybe you go out and you're drinking, and maybe that's with a group of people, and that leads to more mass casualties.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So there's a lot of, and statistics are a tricky thing in this business, and you can use them to find a lot of different answers, and that doesn't necessarily mean it tells the full story.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. I think it was Mark Twain. There's lies, there's damn lies, and then there's statistics. Right. And statistics are, I think, more about the translation than the numbers. Whoever tells us what they mean probably has more in there than the actual numbers.
Right, and it's also a snapshot of 1 year in one region. It certainly doesn't tell the full story.
Yeah.
But it does start a conversation, which we're having now, about whether or not we need to have a greater emphasis on drug driving. The folks over at AAA and others, will rightfully express concern that, as we get closer to a legalization of marijuana, that, there could be a relaxed atmosphere where people feel as if they're comfortable and there's no danger, even though the most experts would agree that the types of marijuana that's being sold and utilized is stronger than it was 30 and 40 years ago.
Oh, yeah. Well, people have to realize that impaired means impaired. It doesn't matter the source. It doesn't matter, but I guess like anything else, we'll have to get used to it one way or the other. That's
right, and even in the states where marijuana has been legalized recreationally in Colorado and Washington and other states, there's no state in the nation that's legalized driving under the influence of marijuana, and that's not going to change here in New York either.
No. Well, boy, okay. That's you grab the tiger by the tail there. That's quite a story.
Well, sometimes the story can be multi-layered, and in this case, I think there's a lot of layers of the onion you have to keep peeling. It's not a simple story, nor are the results simple, and certainly the response from law enforcement can't be simple as well.
Right. Very. Yeah. I like I like the way you put that. That's exactly right. Very good. Well, Robert, I want to thank you for calling us again and getting to have a talk about this.
Anytime.
We still, one of these days, we got to get together and talk for a few hours about all these stories.
There's plenty to talk about here on Long Island.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye. And again, we want to thank Newsday and Robert Brodsky for giving us a call and talking about this.